Hello everyone, and welcome back to the series where I talk about myself and my life in music. Today I'm going to tell you about what I learned teaching over 100 guitar students. I've done a handful of teaching stints. The first was through a music school the year before I did my music degree. It was my only job back then, and I was logging close to full-time hours. When I finished my degree, I went back to that job, taking over a bunch of students from another teacher who had quit, and my first couple years YouTubing I also did Skype lessons. I don't do any private teaching anymore, but if you are interested in learning my system of music, I've made a course that details the rudiments of music theory and how they apply to guitar. It's available over at www.samuraiguitartheory.com, and for the month of June it's 35% off with promo code June35. Anyways, I learned during that first year that there are only so many lessons a human can teach in a week if they want to maintain any semblance of sanity. I taught 4 days a week and had at least 12 students every day. I needed to save money for school, and getting paid $12 an hour was more than I'd made doing anything else, so going into it, I was pretty thrilled. But I found out, unlike other jobs like retail, when you're teaching, you can't totally phone it in. You're the only one in the room with that student. When I was working at the guitar store and I was having a bad day, I would just go into the back and change guitar strings and zone out. If you have a student you don't like and they've prepaid for a bunch of lessons, there's no escaping them. This can be emotionally exhausting, and I definitely wouldn't recommend teaching as many students as I did. If you teach less, you won't get burnt out, and even if you do have some tough students, you'll still have enough energy for the good ones. The next thing I learned pretty quickly is that you can encourage a love of music, but you can't create one. The same goes for motivation. My belief is, as a teacher, your job is to provide a student with as many tools as possible, but ultimately their improvement is in their own hands. From the start, I'll do everything I can to foster a love of music in a new student. I've seen the kind of joy guitar can bring into life, and I want everyone to experience that. Unfortunately, the majority of students I taught through the music school couldn't have cared less about music. Most were younger kids under the age of 12 whose parents had forced them into playing an instrument. I'm very against this parenting philosophy. There is no value in learning music if you don't enjoy the process, and being forced to do something can kill any passion that might grow naturally later on. So for these students, I did my best to make it fun for them. I tried every teaching approach, but there's only so much you can do. No matter what I did, they put nothing into guitar and got nothing out of it. I was really just a glorified babysitter at this point. I had one high school student who showed up with her acoustic guitar. I asked her what kind of music she liked, and I tried to teach that to her. But she didn't care, she never practiced once, and there was nothing I could do to change that. It got to the point where she would leave her guitar in the case and we would just chat about her high school gossip for half an hour. I mean, I told her mom that lessons were pointless, but she kept paying for them. This all ties into my next realization: a 30-minute lesson can feel like a lifetime, or it can go by in the blink of an eye. When I was teaching out of the school, I had maybe 5 students who took music seriously, and I would look forward to these 5 students every week. They would practice hard, they would improve, and we would always have a great time. But when you get a kid who is quiet and uninterested, the minutes drag by painfully slow. You can't move on from the last lesson because they haven't done any work, and you can't shoot the breeze with them because they only mumble one-word answers. However, I learned some techniques to deal with this. First, I would try to talk about Pokemon or Warhammer for as long as humanly possible. I would try to work on the same thing we'd been doing for the last however many weeks. This would kill maybe 10 minutes. I would also get them to play a game that I dubbed Musical Jeopardy, which is the same thing as the board game, but with musical topics and fake meaningless points. This actually seemed to engage the most uninterested students. From there, I would talk about what they should practice, knowing full well that they won't, and maybe talk to their parents for a couple minutes. But trust me, doing this 12 times in an evening, not fun. I've had 2 very different experiences teaching. When I was teaching out of the school, it was a bit of a rough go, but when I started doing YouTube and people started seeking me out for lessons, that changed everything. So I guess that's the next thing I learned. If somebody actively wants to take a lesson from you, you're going to have a totally different experience than if you're just the default guitar teacher. You can also command a much higher wage. When I was teaching out of the school, I think at most I made $15 an hour, whereas when I started teaching Skype lessons, I was charging $50 an hour, and by the end I was charging $100, and there were plenty of people who would happily pay that. My advice for any would-be teachers is make sure you're spending some time finding ways to make your services more desirable. I don't know exactly what that means for you, but even if it doesn't pay off at first, it will in the long run. Another thing I found when people were reaching out to me was that I was dealing with much fewer absolute beginners, whereas at the music school, a large number of the students had never touched an instrument before they showed up for their first lesson. I had no problem with that, assuming they put in the minimum effort, but when I was teaching over Skype, I was teaching more advanced students, more advanced topics. I noticed common places that musicians would get hung up and realized that there's always a way around that. One example would be bar chords and how you can get your fingers working to play those. Another distinction I realized I really needed to make clear is that a C Dorian is very different than the Dorian mode in the key of C. Little things like that help you refine your teaching skills. I also learned you need to make sure that your rescheduling policy is clear and in writing. Everyone says it's fine when you tell them that you need a 24-hour warning to reschedule a lesson, until it actually happens and they find out that you expect them to pay you for a lesson that they didn't show up to. But your time is valuable. You set aside space in your schedule that you could be using to teach another lesson. If they don't give you fair warning, then you should be paid for that time. I've had to put my foot down when dealing with these situations. I've probably lost students over it, but I found that if you have a contract in front of you that you both signed, it makes it a lot easier. Now, being lenient and making the rare exception is okay, but that shouldn't be the expectation. Another thing you figure out pretty quick is which students talk the talk but don't do the work. If a student is willing to put in the work, there is no hurdle that they can't overcome with good teaching. I have yet to have a student that's proved me otherwise. However, there are some who say all the things they think you want to hear but never get any better. And eventually they always admit in some roundabout way that they didn't practice. You figure out how to spot this type fairly quickly. Maybe my biggest takeaway from teaching was that you do have the ability to change someone's life for the better. I had one student who was maybe 13 and his last teacher wasn't great. He would just show him tabs or whatever. But when I started teaching him music, instead of just showing him songs, he really started to bloom. Seeing his growth over that year was incredibly rewarding, and I look forward to those lessons every week. I ran into him in a guitar store a couple years later, and he was playing guitar for real. He had told me what a huge impact I had had on him. It turns out he was dealing with some stuff back then, and guitar and our lessons turned into a way for him to escape. It was one of those things that made up for the tough lessons. You don't get many students like him, but it's special when you do. Ladies and gentlemen, that's about it for today. I don't do any private lessons anymore, but if you'd like me to show you the rudiments of music theory and how they apply to guitar, head over to www.samuraiguitartheory.com. I've made a course with 10 videos and 7 lessons that lays the foundation for the system that I use to conceptualize music. On top of that, it has documentation to accompany the lessons, it has quizzes, and a list of things to practice with the new information. I've had it professionally filmed, animated, and edited. It's the biggest project I've ever tackled, and I really do believe in it. It's 35% off this first month it's released with the promo code June35. Again, that's over at www.samuraiguitartheory.com. I'll link to it in the description too. Thank you all for watching. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned to a wide range of musical related content. I'm Samurai Guitarist, and I will see you again soon.